The morning sun cast long shadows across the Tennessee River as Sarah Mitchell knelt by the water's edge, scrubbing her late husband's shirts against the worn wooden washboard. The rhythmic sound of fabric against wood had become her meditation. These past 18 months since pneumonia claimed David, leaving her alone on their small homestead 3 miles upstream from Copper Falls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 32, Sarah had grown accustomed to solitude. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned each morning for David's approval, now hung in a simple braid down her back. Her hands, soft when she'd been the schoolteacher's wife in town, had grown calloused from chopping wood, tending her vegetable garden, and managing the dozen chickens that provided her modest income through egg sales at the trading post. The homestead sat on a bend of the Tennessee River where the water ran deep and swift, carving its way through the Appalachian foothills of eastern Tennessee. David had chosen the location for its isolation, claiming he needed quiet to write the philosophical treatises that never quite materialized. Sarah had learned to love the peace, even if it meant her nearest neighbor lived 4 miles away through dense forest. This particular morning in late September 1842 carried the crisp promise of autumn. The maples were beginning their transformation from green to gold, and the air held that particular clarity that comes just before the first frost. Sarah had risen early to take advantage of the perfect washing weather, knowing winter would soon make such outdoor chores far more challenging. As she worked, her mind wandered to the practical concerns that occupied most of her thoughts these days. The roof needed repairs before the heavy rains came. Her small savings were dwindling faster than she'd hoped. The trading post owner, Mr. Henderson, had been making increasingly pointed comments about her debt for flour and salt, comments that carried undertones she chose to ignore. The Cherokee situation added another layer of tension to daily life. Since the forced removals 4 years earlier, small bands of Cherokee had reportedly remained hidden in the mountains, avoiding the soldiers and government agents who still patrolled the region. Sarah had never encountered any herself, but stories circulated through the scattered white settlements about mysterious figures glimpsed in the forest, gardens raided in the night, livestock that disappeared without trace. Most of her neighbors spoke of these hidden Cherokee with a mixture of fear and anger, viewing them as dangerous fugitives who threatened the security of honest settlers. Sarah found herself more sympathetic, though she kept such opinions to herself. The idea of families torn from their ancestral home, forced to choose between exile and hiding like hunted animals, stirred something uncomfortable in her conscience. She paused in her scrubbing, straightening to ease the ache in her back. That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the peaceful morning symphony of birdsong and flowing water. A splash, too large and urgent to be a jumping fish or a beaver, then another, followed by what sounded distinctly like a child's cry. Sarah stood quickly, shading her eyes against the morning sun as she scanned the river upstream from her washing spot. The Tennessee ran swift here, fed by mountain streams that kept it high even in the dry months. About 50 yards upstream, where the river curved around a rocky outcropping, she saw movement in the water. A small figure was struggling against the current, arms flailing desperately above the surface before disappearing beneath the dark water, only to emerge again several yards downstream. Even from this distance, Sarah could see the panic in the movements, the way the current was winning against weakening struggles. Without conscious thought, she dropped the shirt she'd been washing and ran along the riverbank, her bare feet finding purchase on the familiar rocks and roots. The figure in the water was clearly a child, probably no more than 8 or 9 years old, being swept downstream by the relentless current toward a series of rapids that would be deadly for anyone caught in them. Sarah's mind raced as she ran. The child was too far out for her to reach from the bank, and by the time she could wade out, the current would have carried the small body into the dangerous rapids. There was only one chance: a fallen oak tree that stretched partway across the river, about 20 yards downstream from where she was running. She'd noticed the tree before, knocked down by a storm the previous spring. Its trunk extended about 15 feet into the river before the current had stripped away the smaller branches, leaving only the main trunk and a few sturdy limbs. It would be treacherous to crawl out on, especially with the bark slick from constant exposure to spray, but it might be her only chance to intercept the drowning child. The child's head disappeared beneath the surface again, staying under longer this time. Sarah's heart hammered as she counted the seconds. 3, 4, 5, before the small form surfaced again, noticeably weaker now, the struggles growing more desperate. Reaching the fallen oak, Sarah kicked off her shoes and hiked up her heavy woolen skirt, tucking it into her belt to free her legs. The bark was indeed slippery, and the trunk swayed alarmingly as she crawled out over the rushing water. Below her, the Tennessee River moved with deceptive smoothness, its dark surface hiding the powerful currents that could easily drag down a grown adult. She could hear the child now, gasping and choking when the small head managed to break the surface. The current was bringing the struggling figure directly toward her position, but timing would be everything. Too early, and she'd miss entirely. Too late, and the child would be swept past into the rapids. Sarah positioned herself as far out on the tree trunk as she dared, her legs wrapped around the slick wood for stability, her arms free to reach. The child was close now, maybe 10 yards upstream, fighting to keep afloat, but clearly losing the battle. That's when she got her first clear look at the drowning figure. It was indeed a child, but not at all what she'd expected. The small face that appeared above the water showed distinctly Cherokee features: high cheekbones, straight black hair plastered against the skull, skin bronzed by sun and outdoor life. The child wore simple clothes, a cotton shirt and leggings that marked them as one of the hidden Cherokee everyone talked about, but few had actually seen. For just a moment, Sarah hesitated. Every story she'd heard painted these hidden Cherokee as dangerous, unpredictable, potentially hostile to white settlers. Helping this child might bring unwanted attention from a band of desperate fugitives who might see her homestead as a target for revenge or plunder. But the moment of hesitation passed quickly, overwhelmed by the simple human reality before her. This was a child drowning in the river, and she was the only person in position to help. Whatever complications might follow, she couldn't live with herself if she let a child die while she watched. The current swept the small figure within reach, and Sarah lunged forward, her right arm extending as far as possible, while her left maintained a death grip on a protruding branch. Her fingers brushed against the child's flailing hand, lost contact, then found it again and locked around the small wrist. The shock of the child's weight hitting her arm nearly pulled her from the tree. The current that had seemed manageable from the bank revealed its true power now, trying to drag both of them downstream toward the rapids. Sarah's shoulders screamed with the strain as she fought to maintain her grip on both the child and the tree. The child, she could see now, it was a girl, probably 7 or 8 years old, had stopped struggling and hung limp in Sarah's grasp, either unconscious or too exhausted to fight anymore. This made pulling her toward the tree easier, but also more urgent. If the child had inhaled too much water, every second mattered. Hand over hand, Sarah worked the girl's body closer to the fallen oak, fighting the current's constant pull. Her own strength was ebbing rapidly. The awkward position and the strain of supporting another person's weight in moving water pushed her muscles toward failure. Just as she thought she might have to let go or be pulled in herself, her left hand found a better grip on a sturdy branch stub. Using this new leverage, she managed to haul the Cherokee girl close enough to the tree trunk to drape the small body across it. Water streamed from the child's clothing and long black hair, and her lips had a bluish tinge that spoke of too much time in the cold river. But she was breathing, taking shallow, gasping breaths that told Sarah they might both survive this ordeal. Getting back to shore proved almost as challenging as the rescue itself. The girl was conscious but weak, able to help only minimally as Sarah half-carried, half-dragged her along the slippery tree trunk toward the riverbank. Several times, Sarah thought they would both slide off into the water, but somehow they managed to reach solid ground. Once on the bank, Sarah immediately turned the child onto her side, pushing gently on her back to help expel river water from her lungs. The girl coughed violently, bringing up alarming amounts of muddy Tennessee River water, but each cough seemed to strengthen her breathing. "Easy now," Sarah murmured, smoothing the wet black hair away from the child's face. "You're safe. You're going to be all right." The Cherokee girl's dark eyes opened, focusing on Sarah's face with a mixture of confusion and fear. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough. Sarah realized the child probably spoke little or no English, adding another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. "My cabin is just up the hill," Sarah said gently, pointing toward her homestead, though she doubted the girl understood her words. "We need to get you warm and dry." The immediate crisis had passed, but Sarah's mind was already racing ahead to the complications this rescue would inevitably bring. She had a Cherokee child at her homestead, one of the hidden fugitives that government agents were still actively hunting. Simply harboring the girl could be seen as a crime against federal law. More practically, the child's family would be looking for her. Cherokee bands in hiding would be intensely protective of their children, and the disappearance of one would likely trigger an immediate and thorough search. If they traced their missing daughter to Sarah's homestead, her isolation would become a vulnerability rather than a preference. But as she looked down at the shivering child, these future concerns seemed secondary to the immediate need for warmth, dry clothes, and hot food. The girl was small for her age, probably undernourished from months of hiding in the wilderness. Her clothes, though well made in the Cherokee style, showed signs of hard use and careful mending. Sarah made her decision. Whatever complications lay ahead, she couldn't leave a child to suffer from cold and exhaustion when she had the means to help. She would deal with the consequences as they arose. "Come on, sweetheart," she said, helping the girl to her feet. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." The child was unsteady, but able to walk with support. Sarah wrapped her own shawl around the small shoulders and guided her up the path to the cabin, acutely aware that this simple act of compassion was about to change her carefully ordered life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The cabin David had built was modest but well constructed, with thick log walls that held warmth efficiently and a stone fireplace that dominated one end of the main room. Sarah settled the Cherokee girl in a chair close to the fire, which still held glowing coals from the morning's cooking. She quickly built up the flames, filling the room with welcome heat. The child sat quietly, her dark eyes taking in the cabin's interior. The simple furniture David had crafted, the shelves lined with his books, the kitchen area where Sarah prepared her solitary meals. If she was surprised by the neat domesticity of white settler life, she gave no sign. Her expression remained carefully neutral, watchful, but not openly fearful. Sarah heated water over the fire and found some of her own clothes that might fit the girl after significant alteration. A cotton nightgown could serve as a dress, and thick wool stockings would help warm feet that were still blue with cold. She also prepared a simple meal, cornbread, milk and honey, foods that should be easy on a stomach that had recently expelled river water. As she worked, Sarah found herself studying the child more closely. The girl's features spoke of Cherokee heritage, but there was something else in her appearance that suggested mixed ancestry. Her skin was lighter than some Cherokee Sarah had seen, and her hair, while black, had a slight wave to it that hinted at European bloodlines somewhere in her family history. The girl's clothes provided more clues about her situation. While clearly Cherokee in style, they were made from materials that suggested contact with white traders, cotton fabric rather than traditional deerskin, metal buttons instead of bone or wood. This implied that wherever she'd come from, it wasn't a completely isolated band surviving entirely on traditional methods. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What's your name?" Sarah asked gently, kneeling beside the child's chair. She pointed to herself. "Sarah, my name is Sarah." The girl looked at her for a long moment, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Lucy." Sarah blinked in surprise. It was an English name, clearly pronounced despite the girl's obvious Cherokee heritage. This suggested a level of cultural mixing that complicated the simple narrative of hidden Cherokee fugitives living in complete separation from white society. "Lucy," Sarah repeated with a smile. "That's a beautiful name. Are you hungry, Lucy?" The child nodded shyly, and Sarah brought her the prepared meal. Lucy ate slowly but steadily, her appetite suggesting she hadn't eaten well recently. As she ate, some color returned to her cheeks, and she began to look around the cabin with more open curiosity rather than guarded wariness. "Where is your family, Lucy?" Sarah asked carefully. "Your mother and father?" Lucy's expression immediately grew troubled. She pointed generally toward the mountains north of the river, then made gestures that Sarah interpreted as indicating distance, far away. Whether this meant her family was searching for her or didn't yet know she was missing remained unclear. As the morning progressed and Lucy warmed up, her personality began to emerge. She was clearly intelligent, watching Sarah's activities with keen interest and occasionally offering to help with small tasks. Despite the language barrier, she seemed to understand much of what Sarah said, suggesting exposure to English even if she wasn't comfortable speaking it. The child's presence transformed the cabin's atmosphere entirely. For 18 months, Sarah had grown accustomed to the profound silence of living alone, broken only by the sounds of wind, wildlife, and her own daily activities. Now every action was observed, every word potentially heard and interpreted. It was both unsettling and oddly comforting. By midday, Lucy had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, exhausted by her ordeal. Sarah covered her with a quilt and sat nearby, finally allowing herself to fully consider the situation she'd entered by pulling a drowning child from the Tennessee River. The moral dimension was clear. She'd saved a life, and no reasonable person could fault her for that, but the practical implications were staggering. Federal agents still patrolled the region looking for Cherokee who had evaded removal. Local militia groups sometimes organized searches of their own. If either group discovered she was harboring a Cherokee child, the consequences could range from legal prosecution to vigilante justice. More immediately, Lucy's family would certainly be searching for her. Cherokee bands in hiding were necessarily small, close-knit groups where every member was precious. The loss of a child would mobilize everyone capable of searching. They would trace Lucy's movements back to the river, and from there to Sarah's homestead. Sarah found herself imagining armed Cherokee warriors surrounding her cabin, demanding the return of the child. Would they see her as a rescuer or a kidnapper? Would they understand that she'd saved Lucy's life, or would they assume the worst about a white woman found with their missing daughter? Yet even as these fears played through her mind, Sarah found she couldn't regret her actions. Looking at Lucy sleeping peacefully by the fire, she felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced since David's death. For the first time in 18 months, she was needed by someone other than her chickens. The afternoon passed quietly. Lucy woke once, accepted some water and a piece of bread, then dozed off again. Sarah used the time to complete neglected chores, bringing in the washing she'd abandoned by the river, feeding her chickens, checking her small garden for vegetables that needed harvesting before the first frost. As evening approached, she faced a new decision. Should she try to return Lucy to her family immediately before the child's disappearance triggered a wider search? Or should she wait to see if the family would come to her, perhaps allowing for a more controlled first contact? The decision was made for her just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains. Lucy woke suddenly from her nap, her head tilted in a listening posture that reminded Sarah of a deer sensing danger. The child's expression grew alert, then worried, then almost relieved. "They're coming," Lucy said in English, her voice small but clear. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. "Your family?" Lucy nodded, then added something in Cherokee that Sarah couldn't understand, but that sounded urgent, almost like a warning. Sarah moved to the cabin's single window, peering out into the gathering darkness. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Just the familiar outlines of her small barn, chicken coop, and the path leading down to the river. Then movement caught her eye, shadows separating themselves from the larger darkness of the forest, moving with purpose toward her homestead. As the figures drew closer, she could make out more details. 3 Cherokee adults, 2 men, and a woman, moving in a loose formation that spoke of caution rather than aggression. They carried weapons, bows, and what looked like rifles, but held them in a ready position rather than aimed toward the cabin. The lead figure, one of the men, raised his hand in what Sarah hoped was a peaceful gesture. She could see his face now in the dim light, strong Cherokee features marked by obvious concern and determination. Behind him, the woman moved with an urgency that suggested she was Lucy's mother. Sarah's mouth went dry as she realized this was the moment that would determine everything. How she handled the next few minutes would decide whether Lucy's rescue led to friendship or tragedy, whether this encounter marked the beginning of something unprecedented or the end of her peaceful life at the river bend. Lucy had moved to stand beside her at the window, and now the child did something that surprised Sarah completely. She took Sarah's hand in her small one and squeezed gently, as if offering comfort and reassurance. "They're good people," Lucy said quietly in English. "They'll understand." Sarah looked down at the child, whose rescue had already changed everything, then back at the Cherokee figures now, just yards from her door. Taking a deep breath, she made her choice and walked toward the cabin entrance, Lucy's small hand still in hers. The moment that would define the rest of her life was about to begin. Sarah opened the cabin door with deliberate slowness, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stepped onto the small wooden porch. Lucy remained close beside her, the child's presence both reassuring and terrifying. In the fading twilight, the 3 Cherokee figures had stopped about 20 feet from the cabin, close enough for Sarah to see their faces clearly, but far enough to avoid appearing threatening. The man in the lead was tall and lean, perhaps 40 years old, with graying streaks in his black hair and intelligent dark eyes that studied Sarah with careful intensity. His clothing mixed traditional Cherokee elements with practical frontier gear: buckskin leggings beneath a cotton shirt, a leather vest decorated with subtle beadwork, and sturdy boots that had seen considerable use. The rifle in his hands was well maintained but pointed downward, a gesture Sarah hoped indicated peaceful intentions. Behind him stood a Cherokee woman who could only be Lucy's mother. The resemblance was unmistakable in the shape of their faces, the set of their shoulders, even the way they both tilted their heads slightly when listening intently. The woman was younger than her male companion, probably in her late 20s, with long black hair braided with ribbons and an expression of barely controlled anxiety as her eyes fixed on Lucy. The third member of their group was another man, younger and more heavily armed, carrying both a rifle and a bow, with a quiver of arrows across his back. His posture suggested he was there primarily for protection, scanning the surrounding area for potential threats rather than focusing entirely on the cabin and its occupants. For a long moment nobody spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with the evening sounds of insects beginning their nightly chorus and the distant murmur of the Tennessee River flowing past Sarah's property. Then Lucy squeezed Sarah's hand and called out something. In Cherokee, her young voice carrying clearly across the space between them. The effect on the Cherokee woman was immediate and dramatic. She took several quick steps forward, speaking rapidly in Cherokee, her voice thick with emotion that needed no translation. Lucy responded in the same language, gesturing toward Sarah and apparently explaining what had happened. The lead man raised his hand and the woman stopped speaking, though her eyes never left Lucy. He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and when he spoke, it was in accented but clear English. "I am Thomas Blackwater," he said, his voice carrying natural authority. "This is my wife Mary, and Lucy is our daughter. We have been searching for her since this morning." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. English speakers meant communication would be possible, and the man's calm demeanor suggested this encounter might not end in violence. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Lucy fell into the river upstream from here. I pulled her out and brought her inside to warm up." Thomas translated this for Mary, who immediately moved closer, her maternal instincts overriding caution. She knelt in front of Lucy, speaking quickly in Cherokee, while running her hands over the child, checking for injuries. Lucy responded with what sounded like reassurances, occasionally pointing back at Sarah and speaking in tones that suggested explanation rather than complaint. "Mary wants to know if Lucy was hurt," Thomas said, watching his wife's examination of their daughter. "She says Lucy went to the river alone this morning against our rules about staying close to camp. She was very cold and had swallowed some water," Sarah replied, "but she seems fine now. I gave her dry clothes and something to eat." As Thomas translated, the third man, who Sarah now realized was probably the group's scout or hunter, said something sharp in Cherokee. Thomas responded with what sounded like a mild rebuke, then turned back to Sarah. "Robert wonders why a white woman would risk herself to save a Cherokee child," Thomas explained. "There are not many who would." The question hung in the air, and Sarah realized her answer would shape everything that followed. She could sense the three adults evaluating not just her words, but her manner, her intentions, her trustworthiness. Lucy, still holding her hand, looked up at her with an expression of quiet confidence that somehow gave Sarah strength. "Because she's a child," Sarah said simply. "I couldn't watch anyone drown, especially not a little girl." Thomas studied her face for a long moment before translating. Mary looked up from her examination of Lucy and said something that made Thomas nod thoughtfully. Robert remained skeptical, his expression unchanged, but he lowered his rifle slightly. "Mary says Lucy told her you were kind," Thomas said. "That you took care of her like a mother would. This is not what we expected to find when we tracked her here." Sarah felt a flush of warmth at the compliment, though she tried not to show it. "I was happy to help. She's a sweet child and very brave. Many adults wouldn't have survived what she went through today." As the conversation continued, Sarah began to understand the complexity of the situation she'd entered. The Blackwater family were clearly not the savage fugitives described in the stories that circulated through white settlements. Thomas spoke educated English and carried himself with the bearing of a natural leader. Mary, while focused primarily on Lucy, moved with quiet dignity and wore clothing that showed both skill and care in its construction. They were obviously living in hiding, but this was a family unit that had maintained Cherokee traditions while adapting to their precarious circumstances. The question was what they intended to do about Sarah's knowledge of their presence in the area. "Where are you staying?" Sarah asked, then immediately worried she'd overstepped boundaries. "I mean, are you far from here?" Lucy seemed very tired when I found her. Thomas exchanged glances with Mary and Robert before answering. "There is a place in the mountains where several families gather, not far but hidden. Lucy should not have wandered so far from safety." Sarah could read between the lines. There was a Cherokee settlement somewhere in the nearby mountains, small enough to escape detection, but large enough to include multiple families. The Blackwaters were part of a group that had successfully evaded the forced removal, creating their own refuge in familiar territory. "How many of you are there?" she asked, then caught herself again. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't pry into your business." "It's a reasonable question," Thomas replied. 43 people, including 12 children. "We've been there since before the soldiers stopped looking so hard." The number surprised Sarah. She'd imagined small family groups, or perhaps a dozen people at most. 43 represented a significant community, one that would require considerable organization and resources to remain hidden successfully. "That's a lot of children to keep safe," she observed. Mary, who had been listening to the English conversation while continuing to fuss over Lucy, spoke to Thomas in Cherokee. He listened, then turned back to Sarah with an expression that might have been amusement. "Mary says you sound like a teacher," he said. "She asks if you have children of your own." The question hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. She and David had wanted children desperately, but none had come during their 7 years of marriage. His death had closed that door permanently, leaving her to face a future without the family she'd dreamed of building. "No," she said quietly. "My husband and we weren't blessed that way. He died last year." Thomas translated this, and Mary's expression immediately softened with sympathy. She said something else in Cherokee, and Thomas nodded. "Mary offers her condolences for your loss," he said. "She also says that perhaps the spirits brought Lucy to you for a reason." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to that observation, so she focused on practical matters instead. "Are you planning to return to your settlement tonight? It's getting quite dark, and the path along the river can be treacherous." "We must return," Thomas said. "Others will be worried, and we don't travel in daylight unless necessary." Robert spoke up then, addressing Thomas in rapid Cherokee. The tone suggested disagreement or concern. Thomas listened, responded briefly, then turned back to Sarah. "Robert thinks it's dangerous to let you know about our settlement," Thomas explained, with careful honesty. "He worries you might tell others where to find us." Sarah felt a chill at the implication. If they couldn't trust her with knowledge of their location, there were limited ways to ensure her silence. She looked at Lucy, who was watching the adult conversation with obvious understanding despite the language barriers, then back at Thomas. "I wouldn't tell anyone," she said firmly. "I understand why you need to stay hidden, and I wouldn't do anything to put children at risk." Thomas translated this exchange, and the discussion in Cherokee became more animated. Mary joined in, gesturing toward Sarah and speaking with obvious passion. Robert responded with what sounded like counter-arguments, his voice remaining low, but his posture tense. Finally, Thomas raised his hand for silence. He spoke briefly to each of his companions, listened to their responses, then turned back to Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "We have decided to trust you," he said simply, "but Robert wants assurance that you understand the consequences if you betray that trust." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand. You're protecting your families. I would do the same in your position." Thomas smiled for the first time since arriving at her cabin. "I believe you would. Mary thinks you have a good heart, and her judgment about people is usually correct." As if to prove this point, Mary stood and approached Sarah directly, speaking in Cherokee while maintaining eye contact. Despite not understanding the words, Sarah sensed the woman was expressing gratitude, perhaps even friendship. "She thanks you for saving Lucy," Thomas translated. "She also says you are welcome in our settlement if you ever need help. Among Cherokee, saving a child creates obligations that go both ways." Sarah felt unexpectedly moved by the offer. For 18 months, she'd been completely alone, dependent entirely on her own resources and facing an uncertain future with dwindling savings and no clear path forward. The idea that she might have allies, even hidden Cherokee allies, was both comforting and overwhelming. "That's very kind," she managed. "I hope I never need to impose on your generosity, but I appreciate knowing it's there." Lucy, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up in English. "Can Sarah visit us? I want to show her my doll." Mary looked questioningly at Thomas, who translated Lucy's request. This prompted another brief discussion. In Cherokee, with Robert looking particularly skeptical, but Mary's voice carried maternal authority, and eventually both men nodded agreement. "Lucy has decided she likes you," Thomas said with obvious amusement. "She rarely takes to strangers so quickly. Mary suggests you might visit our settlement in a few days if you're interested. It would give Lucy a chance to properly thank you and allow us to repay your kindness with a meal." The invitation represented a significant gesture of trust. Revealing the location of their hidden settlement to a white woman was a calculated risk that spoke to their confidence in Sarah's character. It also offered her something she hadn't realized she was missing: the prospect of human companionship. Beyond her occasional trips to the trading post, "I would like that very much," Sarah said, meaning it completely. As the arrangements were being finalized, Sarah became aware of movement in the darkness beyond the Cherokee visitors. At first she thought it might be an animal, but the sound was too regular, too purposeful. Someone else was approaching her homestead. Robert heard it at the same time, his posture immediately shifting to high alert. He said something urgent in Cherokee, and Thomas quickly moved to shield Mary and Lucy while scanning the surrounding darkness. "Someone comes," Thomas whispered to Sarah. "Are you expecting visitors?" Sarah's blood ran cold. She had no regular visitors, and anyone approaching her isolated homestead after dark was either lost or bringing trouble. Given the current circumstances, with 3 Cherokee adults and a child at her cabin, the timing couldn't be worse. "No," she whispered back. "No one comes here at night." The sound of approaching horses became clearer, accompanied by men's voices, and the distinctive jingle of equipment that suggested armed riders. Robert was already melting back into the shadows near the tree line, preparing to disappear entirely if necessary. Thomas kept Mary and Lucy close while calculating distances to cover. "Get inside your cabin," Thomas whispered urgently to Sarah. "Act normal. We'll hide, but stay where we can help if needed." Sarah's mind raced as she quickly ushered Lucy into the cabin, followed by Mary. Thomas paused at the threshold, his expression serious. "If these men cause trouble, make noise," he said quietly. "We won't leave you to face danger alone." Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness with the silence of someone who had learned to move unseen. Sarah closed the cabin door and quickly surveyed the interior, looking for any obvious signs of Cherokee presence. Lucy's wet clothes were still hanging by the fire, and there were extra dishes on the table, but in the dim light, these details might not be immediately noticeable. The riders were close now, perhaps 6 or 8 horses from the sound. Sarah moved to the window and peered out carefully, trying to identify the approaching visitors without making herself obvious. What she saw made her stomach clench with fear. 8 mounted men were approaching her cabin, and even in the darkness, she could recognized the leader, James Crawford, the self-appointed captain of the local militia group that had formed to deal with the Indian problem. Crawford was a large, aggressive man who owned the largest farm in the valley and had strong opinions about Cherokee, who'd evaded removal. Behind Crawford rode his usual associates, mostly younger men looking for excitement and older ones nursing grudges against Cherokee from past conflicts. They were all armed, and their purposeful approach suggested this wasn't a social call. Sarah's heart hammered as she realized the terrible timing of this visit. Crawford's militia had been increasingly active lately, following up on rumors of Cherokee sightings and searching properties they suspected might be harboring fugitives. If they found evidence of Cherokee presence at her homestead, the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. The riders halted in front of her cabin, and Crawford's voice boomed across the small clearing. "Mrs. Mitchell, come out here. We need to talk to you." Sarah took a deep breath, smoothed her skirt, and opened the cabin door, stepping onto the porch with what she hoped looked like calm curiosity rather than terror. "Mr. Crawford," she said, keeping her voice level, "this is rather late for a visit. Is something wrong?" Crawford dismounted, his bulk making the movement awkward, and approached the porch with the swagger of a man accustomed to intimidating others through sheer physical presence. "We've had reports of Indian sign along the river," he said without preamble. "Tracks, disturbed ground, maybe a camp nearby. You seen anything unusual?" Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral while her mind raced through possible responses. Crawford's men were spreading out around her property, some dismounting to examine the ground more closely. If they found the Cherokee tracks leading to and from her cabin, her careful denials would become worthless. "I haven't seen anyone," she said carefully. "But then, I don't spend much time away from the homestead." Crawford studied her face in the dim light spilling from her cabin's windows. "You sure about that? Because we've got reason to believe there might be Cherokee hiding somewhere in this area. Could be dangerous for a woman living alone," one of Crawford's men called out from near the river. "Captain found tracks down by the water. Fresh ones, looks like." Sarah's heart sank as Crawford's expression sharpened with interest. He turned toward the river, then back to her with obvious suspicion. "Tracks, you say?" Crawford called back to his man. "How many?" "Hard to tell in this light, but definitely recent. Somebody was down there today." Crawford took a step closer to Sarah, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "Now, Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you one more time. Have you seen any Indians around here today?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, acutely aware that Lucy was probably listening from inside the cabin, and that Thomas, Mary, and Robert were somewhere in the darkness, ready to act if this confrontation turned violent. "Mr. Crawford," she said with as much authority as she could muster, "I've told you I haven't seen anyone. If there are tracks by the river, they could be from anyone. Trappers, travelers, people watering their horses. This is a public waterway." Crawford's eyes narrowed, and Sarah could see he wasn't satisfied with her answers. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and she knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the safety of the Cherokee family that had trusted her with their secret. Crawford stepped closer to Sarah's porch, his heavy boots making the wooden boards creak ominously. The militia leader's bulk cast a large shadow in the lamplight spilling from her cabin, and Sarah could smell the whiskey on his breath even from several feet away. Behind him, his men continued their search of her property, their voices carrying across the clearing as they examined every corner for signs of Cherokee presence. "Mrs. Mitchell," Crawford said, his tone taking on the false reasonableness that Sarah recognized as particularly dangerous, "I think you might be confused about what constitutes helping versus harboring. See, there's a difference between a traveler stopping for water and Indians setting up camp on your land." Sarah forced herself to remain calm, though her heart was racing. Inside the cabin, Lucy was undoubtedly listening to every word, and somewhere, In the darkness, Thomas, Mary, and Robert were positioned to intervene if necessary. The last thing she wanted was for this confrontation to escalate into violence that could endanger the child. "I understand the distinction, Mr. Crawford," Sarah replied evenly. "But as I've told you, I haven't seen anyone setting up any kind of camp. If people use the river for water, that's hardly unusual." One of Crawford's younger men, a lanky fellow named Pete Harrison, whom Sarah recognized from the trading post, jogged back from his examination of the riverbank. His excited expression suggested he'd found something significant. "Captain, you need to see this," Pete called out. "There's definitely been activity down there. Looks like someone was washing clothes, and there's footprints leading right up to this cabin." Sarah's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression neutral. Her abandoned laundry from the morning rescue was still down by the river. She'd been too focused on Lucy's welfare to retrieve it before the Cherokee family arrived. Crawford's eyes lit up with satisfaction. "Is that so? Well, Mrs. Mitchell, seems like your memory might need some refreshing. Pete, show me these footprints." As Crawford prepared to examine the evidence himself, Sarah made a desperate calculation. If they found clear Cherokee tracks leading to her cabin, her denials would become impossible to maintain. But there might be a way to explain some of the evidence without revealing the full truth. "Mr. Crawford, wait," she called out before he could leave the porch. "I should probably mention that I was doing laundry down by the river this morning. I left some things there when the weather started looking uncertain." Crawford paused, studying her face intently. "Doing laundry, were you? And I suppose that explains all the footprints Pete found?" "It explains my footprints," Sarah said carefully. "As for others, I really couldn't say. The riverbank gets a lot of views from various travelers." Crawford descended from the porch and gestured for two of his men to accompany him to the river. "We'll just have a look at this laundry of yours, Mrs. Mitchell. Make sure everything's as innocent as you claim." As Crawford and his men headed toward the water, Sarah noticed movement in the tree line beyond her cabin. A shadow shifted slightly, and she caught a glimpse of what might have been Thomas, positioning himself for a better view of the situation. The knowledge that she wasn't completely alone provided some comfort, though she prayed the Cherokee would remain hidden unless absolutely necessary. The remaining militia members continued searching her property, examining her small barn, chicken, co-op, and the area around her cabin for any signs of recent Cherokee presence. Sarah watched anxiously as one man studied the ground near her front door, noting the multiple sets of footprints in the soft earth. "Mrs. Mitchell," called out one of the searchers, "you had visitors today?" Sarah's mind raced. The footprints were clear evidence that more than one person had been near her cabin recently. Denying it would be pointless, but she needed an explanation that wouldn't implicate the Cherokee family. "Earlier this afternoon," she said, hoping her voice sounded casual, "a traveling family stopped to water their horses and asked directions to the main road. I gave them some food for their journey." The militiaman nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief before realizing that Crawford was returning from the river, and his expression was far from pleased. "Found your laundry, Mrs. Mitchell," Crawford announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Interesting thing, though. Looks like someone was in quite a hurry when they left it. Shirts and such just dropped right there on the bank, still wet." Sarah's heart sank. She had indeed abandoned her washing when she heard Lucy's cries for help, leaving the wet clothes scattered on the riverbank in her haste to attempt the rescue. "I told you the weather looked uncertain," she said, trying to maintain her story. "I hurried to get back to the cabin before it started raining." Crawford wasn't buying it. "Uh-huh. And this hurry, it wouldn't have had anything to do with helping certain people who shouldn't be in these parts." Before Sarah could respond, one of the men searching her barn called out with obvious excitement, "Captain, found something over here!" Crawford immediately headed toward the barn, his swagger more pronounced now that he sensed he was closing in on proof of Cherokee presence. Sarah followed, dreading what evidence might have been discovered. The militiaman was holding up a small object that gleamed in the torchlight. As they drew closer, Sarah could see it was a silver bracelet, delicately crafted with Cherokee designs, etched into the metal. Her heart stopped as she realized it must have fallen from Lucy's wrist during the rescue or while they were getting her into dry clothes. "Well, well," Crawford said, taking the bracelet and examining it closely. "This is Cherokee work, no mistake about it. Beautiful craftsmanship. Question is, Mrs. Mitchell, how did it end up in your barn?" Sarah's mind went blank. There was no innocent explanation for Cherokee jewelry on her property, especially not after all the other suspicious evidence Crawford's men had uncovered. The bracelet was clearly a child's size, which would make the situation even worse if Crawford realized its significance. I don't know how that got there," she stammered. Knowing how weak it sounded even as she spoke, Crawford smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Don't know, eh? Just like you don't know about the footprints, or the abandoned laundry, or the visitors who watered their horses. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm starting to think you've been less than honest with us tonight." The situation was spiraling out of control rapidly. Sarah could see Crawford's men becoming more aggressive in their search, emboldened by their leader's obvious belief that they were on to something significant. If they decided to search inside her cabin, they would find Lucy's wet clothes by the fire, along with the extra dishes that would provide further evidence of Cherokee presence. "Mr. Crawford," Sarah said, trying to inject authority into her voice, "I don't appreciate the implication that I'm lying to you. I've answered your questions truthfully, and now I'd like you and your men to leave my property." Crawford laughed harshly. "Leave? Mrs. Mitchell, I think we're just getting started. Boys, I want a thorough search of this entire homestead. Check every building, every corner. If there are Indians hiding here, we're going to find them." As Crawford's men began moving toward her cabin with obvious intent, Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. Lucy was inside, undoubtedly terrified by the loud voices and aggressive searching. If the militia found her, the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. That's when Thomas Blackwater stepped out of the shadows. He moved, with deliberate calm, emerging from the darkness near the tree line with his hands visible but ready. His rifle was slung across his back rather than held in a threatening position. But his presence immediately commanded attention from every militia member present. "I believe you're looking for me," Thomas said in clear, educated English that caught several of Crawford's men off guard. Crawford spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward his pistol. "Well, I'll be damned. Boys, we got ourselves a live one." "My name is Thomas Blackwater," Thomas continued, ignoring the weapons now being pointed in his direction. "I came here tonight to retrieve something my daughter lost by the river today." Sarah held her breath as Thomas held up an identical silver bracelet to the one Crawford had found in her barn. The implication was clear. Lucy had lost one bracelet during her ordeal in the river, and Thomas was claiming it had been found on Sarah's property purely by coincidence. Crawford studied Thomas carefully, taking in his educated speech, calm demeanor, and the quality of his clothing. This was clearly not the savage fugitive he'd been expecting to capture. "Your daughter, you say?" Crawford asked suspiciously. "And where might this daughter be now?" "Safe with her mother in our camp," Thomas replied smoothly. "We've been searching for her missing bracelet all evening. She was quite upset about losing it." Sarah watched this exchange with amazement. Thomas was providing Crawford with a plausible explanation for the Cherokee presence on her property, while simultaneously drawing attention away from the cabin where Lucy was hiding. It was a calculated risk that demonstrated both courage and quick thinking. "And you just happened to be looking for this bracelet on Mrs. Mitchell's property," Crawford pressed. That's quite a coincidence. Thomas nodded toward the river. Children play by the water. Sometimes they lose things. We've been checking all along the riverbank where she might have been today. One of Crawford's men spoke up, nervously. Captain, there's more of them out there. I can feel it. Crawford's head swiveled as he tried to peer into the darkness surrounding Sarah's homestead. The knowledge that Thomas might not be alone had shifted the tactical situation significantly. Where moments before Crawford had held all the advantages, now he faced the possibility of Cherokee warriors positioned in the shadows around his men. "How many of you are out there?" Crawford demanded, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. Thomas smiled slightly. "Enough to ensure my safe return to my family." It was a masterful response, neither confirming nor denying the presence of other Cherokee, while strongly suggesting that Crawford's men were potentially surrounded. Sarah could see the militia members looking nervously into the darkness, their earlier enthusiasm for confrontation dampened by the realization that they might be outnumbered. Crawford was clearly struggling with the changed dynamics of the situation. His original plan had involved intimidating a lone white woman into revealing Cherokee hiding places. Now he faced an articulate Cherokee leader who showed no fear and hinted at backup nearby. "You're on white man's land illegally," Crawford said, falling back on official authority. "All Cherokee are supposed to be west of the Mississippi by now. Some of us choose to remain in the land of our ancestors." Thomas replied calmly, "We harm no one and take nothing that isn't freely given." "The government says different," Crawford shot back. "There's still bounties on Cherokee who evaded removal." Sarah watched this verbal sparring with growing tension. While Thomas was handling Crawford skillfully, the situation remained dangerous for everyone involved. The militia leader's pride was at stake now, and men like Crawford were often most dangerous when they felt their authority being challenged. "Mr. Crawford," Sarah interjected, hoping to diffuse the situation before violence erupted. "Mr. Blackwater has explained about the bracelet. His daughter lost it by the river, and he came to look for it. Surely that's not a crime." Crawford turned his attention back to Sarah, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm beginning to think you know more about these Cherokee than you've been letting on. Matter of fact, I'm wondering if you might be providing aid and comfort to federal fugitives." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that Crawford was now viewing her as part of the problem rather than simply an unwitting bystander. The legal implications of harboring Cherokee fugitives were serious. She could face federal prosecution, property seizure, even imprisonment. "I'm a law-abiding citizen," Sarah said firmly. "I've done nothing wrong." "We'll see about that," Crawford replied. "Boys, I want that cabin searched top to bottom. If Mrs. Mitchell is hiding Cherokee, we're going to find the evidence." As Crawford's men began moving toward her cabin again, Sarah felt the situation careening toward disaster. Lucy was inside, and no amount of explanation would justify the presence of a Cherokee child in her home. Thomas seemed to sense the crisis as well, his posture shifting subtly as he prepared for more direct action. That's when Mary Blackwater stepped into the circle of light surrounding Sarah's cabin. She moved with quiet dignity, carrying herself like the mother she was, her focus entirely on Crawford and his men. When she spoke, it was in English nearly as clear as her husband's, though accented with the musical intonations of Cherokee speech. "My husband tells the truth," Mary said simply. "We came only for what was lost. We wish no trouble with anyone." Crawford stared at her, clearly not having expected a Cherokee woman to speak English or to present herself so calmly in the face of armed white men. His men seemed equally surprised, lowering their weapons slightly as they tried to process this development. "Both of you, eh?" Crawford said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier aggression. "And I suppose there's more where you came from." "We are a peaceful people," Mary replied. We ask only to live quietly in the mountains without bothering anyone. Sarah watched this exchange with growing hope. Mary's presence had fundamentally altered the emotional tenor of the confrontation. Where Thomas represented potential threat and challenge to Crawford's authority, Mary embodied the human reality of Cherokee families simply trying to survive. Even Crawford's men seemed affected by her quiet dignity. But the militia leader was still determined to assert his authority and justify his night's work to his followers. "Peaceful or not, you're here illegally," Crawford insisted. "The law says all Cherokee go west. I'm thinking we need to escort you folks to the authorities in town. Let them sort out what to do with you." Thomas and Mary exchanged glances, communicating without words, in the way long-married couples could. Sarah sensed they were making rapid calculations about their options, none of which looked particularly promising. "Mr. Crawford," Sarah said suddenly, inspiration striking her, "it's quite late, and these people have explained their presence here. Perhaps this matter would be better handled in daylight, through proper channels, rather than in the middle of the night." Crawford turned to study her suspiciously. "You seem mighty concerned about these Cherokee, Mrs. Mitchell. Makes a man wonder about your sympathies." "My sympathies are with peaceful resolution of conflicts," Sarah replied, "and with treating all people, regardless of their ancestry, with basic human dignity." It was a bold statement that clearly marked her position in the growing confrontation. Crawford's expression darkened as he realized that Sarah was actively opposing his plans, rather than simply trying to stay out of the situation. "Is that so?" Crawford said slowly. "Well, Mrs. Mitchell, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about your role in all this. Boys, search that cabin. I want to know exactly what Mrs. Mitchell has been hiding from us." As Crawford's men resumed their advance on her cabin, Sarah felt time running out. Lucy was inside, along with evidence of Cherokee presence that would be impossible to explain away. The situation was about to explode into violence or capture, with consequences that would extend far beyond this single night. Thomas must have sensed the same thing, because he took a step forward, his hand moving, closer to his weapon. "I don't think that will be necessary," he said, his voice carrying new steel. Crawford's head snapped toward him. "You threatening me, Indian?" "I'm simply suggesting that searching the lady's home without proper authority might not be wise," Thomas replied calmly. The standoff was complete now, Crawford's militia facing Thomas and Mary, with Sarah caught in the middle and Lucy hidden inside the cabin that was about to be searched. In the darkness beyond the circle of light, Sarah was certain that Robert and possibly other Cherokee warriors were positioned and ready to act. What happened next would determine not only the immediate fate of everyone present, but potentially the future of the entire hidden Cherokee settlement in the mountains above. The tension in Sarah's small clearing had reached a breaking point. Crawford's men stood poised to search her cabin, their rifles ready, while Thomas and Mary Blackwater faced them with quiet determination. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. One wrong word or sudden movement could trigger violence that would shatter the fragile peace of this Tennessee Valley forever. That's when the cabin door opened, and Lucy stepped onto the porch. The 8-year-old moved with the peculiar fearlessness that sometimes comes to children in adult crises, walking directly to the porch railing and looking out at the assembled men with curious, unafraid eyes. She wore one of Sarah's nightgowns, altered hastily to fit her small frame, and her long black hair fell loose around her shoulders, still slightly damp from her river ordeal. "Papa!" she called out in clear English, her young voice cutting through, the adult tension like a knife. "Why are all these men here?" The effect on the standoff was immediate and dramatic. Crawford's men, who had been advancing on the cabin with weapons ready, stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the Cherokee child who had just emerged from the white woman's home. Crawford himself seemed stunned into momentary silence, his mouth hanging open as he processed this unexpected development. Mary took a step toward the porch, her maternal instincts overriding tactical concerns. "Lucy, stay there, sweetheart," she called in English, then added something urgent in Cherokee that made the child nod solemnly. Thomas maintained his calm exterior, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he realized that Lucy's appearance had fundamentally altered the situation. There would be no explaining away a Cherokee child emerging from Sarah's cabin, no matter how skillfully he might navigate the verbal confrontation with Crawford. "Well, I'll be damned," Crawford finally managed, his voice thick with triumph and suspicion. "Looks like we found what we were looking for after all. Mrs. Mitchell, you want to explain why there's an Indian child coming out of your cabin wearing your clothes?" Sarah's mind raced frantically, searching for any explanation that might deflect Crawford's suspicions without putting Lucy in greater danger. But before she could speak, Lucy herself provided an answer that no adult had anticipated. "I fell in the river," the child announced with the straightforward honesty that only children possess. "Sarah saved me. She pulled me out and gave me warm clothes and food because I was very cold and scared." The simple truth, delivered in Lucy's clear, unaccented English, created a moment of profound silence in the clearing. Crawford's men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not having expected to hear such a coherent explanation from a Cherokee child, spoken in better English than some of them possessed. Crawford himself seemed thrown off balance by Lucy's directness. You fell in the river?" he repeated, as if trying to process this information. Lucy nodded earnestly. "This morning, I was trying to catch fish for Mama, but the water was too fast and I got swept away. Sarah saw me drowning and climbed out on a big tree to pull me out. She saved my life." Mary's expression softened with a mixture of pride in her daughter's courage and maternal concern over the danger Lucy had faced. Thomas watched Crawford carefully, trying to gauge how the militia leader would respond to this unexpected revelation. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Lucy's innocent explanation had transformed the narrative from one of suspicious harboring of Cherokee fugitives to a simple rescue story that even Crawford's men could understand and potentially sympathize with. "The child nearly drowned," Sarah said, finding her voice and seizing on Lucy's honesty. "I couldn't very well leave her to freeze to death after pulling her from the river. Any decent person would have done the same." One of Crawford's younger men, the one who had found the tracks by the river, spoke up hesitantly. "Captain, if the kid was drowning and Mrs. Mitchell saved her life—" Crawford silenced him with a sharp look. But Sarah could see that Lucy's story was having an impact on several of the militia members. These were fathers and brothers themselves, men who might react poorly to Cherokee adults, but found it harder to view a polite, articulate child as a threat. "That's a real touching story," Crawford said, though his tone remained skeptical. "But it doesn't change the fact that these Cherokee are here illegally, and Mrs. Mitchell has been harboring them." Thomas stepped forward slightly. "My daughter was dying. Mrs. Mitchell saved her life. Among Cherokee people, this creates sacred obligations. We came tonight to express our gratitude and retrieve Lucy safely." "Sacred obligations?" Crawford repeated mockingly. "That's real nice, but the law doesn't recognize Indian ceremonies or obligations. The law says all Cherokee go west, and that includes children who go wandering where they shouldn't." Lucy's young face showed confusion at Crawford's hostile tone. She looked from her parents to Sarah, clearly not understanding why her rescue story hadn't resolved the conflict the way she'd expected it would. "Why are you angry?" she asked Crawford. "Directly. Sarah helped me. Helping people is good." The question, delivered with innocent curiosity, seemed to catch Crawford off guard. Several of his men shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah sensed that Lucy's presence was forcing them to confront the human reality behind their abstract hostility. Toward Cherokee people, Crawford struggled to find a response that would maintain his authority while dealing with a child's logic. "It's not about helping," he said finally. "It's about law and order. Your people aren't supposed to be here." "But this is where we live," Lucy replied with simple certainty. "This is our home." The statement hung in the air with devastating clarity. Here was a child, speaking perfect English, expressing the fundamental human desire for home and belonging that transcended political boundaries and government policies. Even Crawford's most hardened followers seemed affected by the simple truth of it. Mary moved closer to the porch, her focus entirely on her daughter. "Lucy, come down here to Mama," she said gently. "These men need to talk to Papa and Sarah." But Lucy, with the stubborn independence that had gotten her into trouble at the river that morning, remained on the porch. "I want to stay with Sarah," she announced. "She took care of me when I was scared." Sarah felt her heart contract with unexpected emotion. The bond that had formed between them during their brief time together was clearly stronger than she'd realized, and Lucy's public declaration of trust and affection moved her deeply. It also complicated the situation further. Crawford was watching this interaction with obvious calculation, recognizing that the relationship between Sarah and Lucy represented leverage he could potentially exploit. "Seems like the child has gotten mighty attached to you, Mrs. Mitchell," Crawford observed. "Makes a man wonder just how long this rescue has been going on." Sarah bristled at the implication. "She's been here since this afternoon. I already explained that to you. Did you now?" Crawford stepped closer to the porch, studying Lucy intently. "Tell me, little girl, has Mrs. Mitchell been taking care of Cherokee children before today?" Lucy looked confused by the question. "No, I never saw her before I fell in the river." Crawford's expression showed disappointment that his attempt to establish a pattern of Cherokee harboring had failed, but he quickly shifted tactics, recognizing another opportunity. "Well then, seems to me the Christian thing to do would be to reunite this child with her parents and send them all on their way to where they're supposed to be," Crawford announced. "Mrs. Mitchell has done her good deed for the day. Now it's time for these Cherokee to move along." Thomas and Mary exchanged worried glances. Crawford was trying to force them to leave immediately, which would require revealing the direction of their hidden settlement or finding some way to disappear into the mountains with their daughter in the middle of the night. "Mr. Crawford," Sarah said carefully, "it's very late, and the child has been through a traumatic experience today. Perhaps everyone could rest tonight and address these matters in the morning when cooler heads can prevail." Crawford laughed harshly. "Rest? Mrs. Mitchell, I think you misunderstand the situation here. These Cherokee are fugitives from federal law. I'm not about to let them disappear back into the mountains so they can cause more trouble." "What trouble have we caused?" Thomas asked pointedly. "We live quietly, harm no one, take nothing that isn't freely given. My daughter fell in a river and was saved by a kind woman. Where is the trouble in that?" Crawford's face darkened. "The trouble is that you people are supposed to be gone. The trouble is that every Cherokee who stays behind encourages others to resist lawful government orders. The trouble is that your very presence here undermines the authority of the United States government." Thomas absorbed this speech calmly, then responded with quiet dignity. "We understand that you see our presence as a problem, but we are peaceful people who wish only to live on the land of our ancestors. We offer no resistance to your government, except the passive resistance of remaining in our homeland." "Passive resistance is still resistance," Crawford shot back, "and it ends today. You people are coming with us to town, where the proper authorities can decide what to do with you." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. If Thomas, Mary, and Lucy were taken to town, they would likely be imprisoned, while arrangements were made to force them westward along the Trail of Tears. Lucy would be separated from everything familiar, forced into an exile that had already killed thousands of Cherokee. "You can't just arrest people for existing," Sarah said, surprising herself with the force of her own words. "They haven't committed any crimes." Crawford turned on her with renewed suspicion. "Mrs. Mitchell, your sympathies are becoming clearer by the minute. Makes me wonder if you've been planning to help these Cherokee all along." "My only plan was to save a drowning child," Sarah replied firmly. "If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then I'll face whatever consequences you think I deserve." Lucy, who had been listening to this adult conversation with growing distress, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that sometimes comes to children in crisis. "Why can't we all just be friends?" she asked, looking directly at Crawford. "Sarah is nice, Mama and Papa are nice. You could be nice too." The simple question, asked without guile or manipulation, created another moment of profound silence. Several of Crawford's men looked uncomfortable, confronted once again with a child's perspective on their adult conflicts. Crawford himself seemed momentarily at a loss for words. How do you explain racial hatred, government policy, and territorial disputes to an 8-year-old who sees only people being kind or unkind to each other? But before Crawford could formulate a response, new complications arose from an unexpected quarter. One of his men who had been standing guard at the edge of the clearing came running back with obvious alarm. "Captain!" the man called out breathlessly. "We got company coming. Riders approaching from the south, moving fast." Crawford's head snapped toward the darkness beyond Sarah's homestead. His tactical instincts immediately engaged. How many?" "Hard to tell in the dark, but sounds like a lot of horses. Could be a dozen or more." Sarah felt her blood run cold. More armed men arriving at her isolated homestead could only mean greater danger for everyone involved. If these were additional militia members, the Cherokee family would be hopelessly outnumbered. If they were Cherokee warriors coming to rescue Thomas, Mary, and Lucy, the confrontation could escalate into open warfare. Thomas seemed to recognize the same possibilities, his posture shifting as he prepared for whatever was coming. Mary moved closer to the porch, her maternal instincts focused on protecting Lucy, regardless of the broader tactical situation. The sound of approaching horses became clearly audible to everyone in the clearing, accompanied by voices and the jingle of equipment that suggested a substantial armed group. Crawford's men automatically formed a defensive formation, their weapons ready, while Thomas faded slightly toward the shadows near the tree line. "Papa?" Lucy called out, her young voice showing fear for the first time since she'd appeared on the porch. The approaching riders represented unknown danger, and even her child's optimism couldn't ignore the tension suddenly radiating from all the adults around her. "Stay on the porch, sweetheart," Thomas called back, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "Sarah will keep you safe." The vote of confidence in Sarah's protective abilities struck her as both touching and terrifying, given that she had no idea how to keep anyone safe in the rapidly deteriorating situation. Crawford was barking orders to his men, positioning them to face the approaching riders while maintaining watch on Thomas and Mary. "If this is Cherokee War Party, we hold our ground and fight if necessary," he announced. "Nobody runs, nobody surrenders." But as the riders drew closer and their voices became more distinct, it became clear that these were not Cherokee warriors. The language being spoken was English, with accents and speech patterns that marked the speakers as white settlers rather than Native Americans. "That's not Cherokee," one of Crawford's men observed with obvious relief. "No," Crawford agreed grimly, "but that doesn't mean they're friendly to our cause either." As the first of the approaching riders came into view at the edge of Sarah's clearing, their identities became clear. Leading the group was Dr. William Hayes, the circuit physician who served the scattered settlements throughout this part of Tennessee. Behind him rode approximately 15 men that Sarah recognized as farmers, merchants, and craftsmen from the wider community. Dr. Hayes dismounted and approached the tense gathering with the air of a man accustomed to taking charge. In crisis situations, he was in his 50s, gray-haired and dignified, with the kind of natural authority that came from years of making life and death decisions in frontier medical practice. "Crawford," Dr. Hayes said without preamble, "what exactly is going on here?" Crawford straightened, trying to reassert his leadership role in the face of this new arrival. "Dr. Hayes, we're conducting official militia business. Found Cherokee fugitives on Mrs. Mitchell's property, possibly being harbored illegally." Dr. Hayes looked around the clearing, taking in the armed militia members, the Cherokee family standing near the porch, and Lucy still visible in her nightgown. On the porch steps, his expression suggested he was rapidly assessing a complex situation. "I see," Dr. Hayes said neutrally. "And what exactly has transpired here tonight?" Sarah seized the opportunity to present her version of events before Crawford could frame the narrative entirely in terms of Cherokee law-breaking and white settler victimization. "Dr. Hayes," she called out, "I rescued a drowning child from the river this morning. Her parents came tonight to retrieve her safely. Mr. Crawford arrived and seems determined to treat a rescue as some kind of criminal conspiracy." Dr. Hayes studied Sarah's face, then looked at Lucy on the porch, then at Thomas and Mary. "A drowning child, you say? And this child would be—" Lucy, with the social confidence that had served her well throughout the evening, spoke up for herself. "I'm Lucy. I fell in the river and Sarah saved me. She gave me warm clothes and food and took care of me all day." Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "I see, and you are—" "Thomas Blackwater," Thomas replied. "This is my wife Mary, and Lucy is our daughter. We came to express our gratitude to Mrs. Mitchell and take Lucy home safely." The physician processed this information, while Crawford waited impatiently for support in his position that the Cherokee family should be arrested and removed. "Dr. Hayes," Crawford said, "these Cherokee are here in violation of federal law. They need to be turned over to proper authorities for transport west." Dr. Hayes held up a hand for silence, then addressed Thomas directly. "Mr. Blackwater, where exactly do you and your family reside?" It was a crucial question that could expose the location of the hidden Cherokee settlement. Thomas hesitated, clearly calculating how much information he could safely reveal. "In the mountains north of here," Thomas replied carefully. "We live, and quietly, and harm no one." Dr. Hayes nodded again, then surprised everyone by addressing his next question to Lucy. "Young lady, did Mrs. Mitchell treat you kindly while you were in her care?" Lucy beamed. "She was very nice to me. She made sure I was warm and gave me good food and told me I was brave. I wish I could visit her again." The child's innocent testimony carried more weight than any adult argument could have provided. Dr. Hayes looked around the assembled men, his expression thoughtful. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "it seems to me that what we have here is a straightforward case of Christian charity. Mrs. Mitchell saved a child's life and provided care until the parents could arrive. I see no crime in that, regardless of anyone's ancestry." Crawford's face darkened with frustration. "Dr. Hayes, with respect, the issue isn't charity, it's law. These Cherokee are federal fugitives." Dr. Hayes fixed Crawford with a steady gaze. "And what law exactly do you propose to enforce by separating a child from parents who are causing no harm to anyone?" The question hung in the air, challenging Crawford to justify his aggressive stance in terms that would satisfy the broader community representation that Dr. Hayes had brought with him. Sarah could see several of Crawford's own men looking uncertain, possibly questioning whether their militia leader's hardline approach was truly warranted in this situation. The arrival of Dr. Hayes and the community representatives had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Sarah's clearing, introducing voices of moderation and reason into what had been escalating toward violence. But Crawford was not a man who yielded easily to pressure, and Sarah sensed that the confrontation was far from over. Dr. Hayes moved closer to the center of the gathering, his medical bag still in hand from whatever emergency had originally called him out into the night. The 15 men who had ridden with him spread out slightly, their presence creating a buffer zone between Crawford's aggressive militia and the Cherokee family. Sarah could see that these community representatives included several men whose opinions carried significant weight in the scattered settlements of eastern Tennessee. Among them was Judge Marcus Fleming, whose circuit court provided the only formal legal authority for hundreds of miles. Beside him stood Reverend Samuel Morrison from the Presbyterian Church in Copper Falls, whose moral authority extended far beyond his small congregation. There was also Benjamin Wright, the most successful merchant in the region, and several substantial farmers whose prosperity gave them influence in community affairs. Crawford clearly recognized the challenge these arrivals represented to his authority. His militia was effectively surrounded now, not by hostile Cherokee warriors, as he had feared, but by the very white settlers whose safety and interests he claimed to represent. "Dr. Hayes," Crawford said, attempting to reassert control of the situation, "I appreciate your concern, but this is a militia matter involving federal fugitives. We don't need outside interference." Judge Fleming stepped forward, his white beard and formal bearing commanding immediate attention. "Captain Crawford, I don't believe anyone here is interfering with legitimate law enforcement. However, I am curious about the legal basis for your actions tonight." Crawford's jaw tightened. Judge Fleming's presence meant that any arrests or seizures would be subject to immediate legal scrutiny, potentially undermining Crawford's entire approach to the Cherokee problem. "The legal basis is the Indian Removal Act," Crawford replied stiffly. "All Cherokee are required to relocate west of the Mississippi. These people are in violation of federal law." Judge Fleming nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, the Removal Act exists. However, I'm not aware of any federal marshals or authorized agents present tonight. Under what authority are you acting, Captain?" The question struck at the heart of Crawford's vulnerability. His militia had no official federal mandate, operating instead under loose territorial authority that was questionable at best when applied to Cherokee, who had never formally surrendered or been captured. "We're acting under territorial defense provisions," Crawford said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Cherokee fugitives represent a potential threat to settler safety." Reverend Morrison spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying the moral weight of years spent counseling his frontier congregation. "Captain Crawford, what specific threat do you see in a family seeking to retrieve their rescued child?" Lucy, who had been listening to this adult discussion with wide eyes, took the Reverend's question as an invitation to contribute her own perspective. "We don't hurt anybody," she said earnestly. "We just live in the mountains and try to stay out of the way." Her simple statement created another moment of powerful silence. Here was a Cherokee child, speaking perfect English, articulating the basic desire for peaceful coexistence that undermined Crawford's narrative of Cherokee threats and dangers. Dr. Hayes knelt down to Lucy's eye level, speaking to her with the gentle authority he used with all his young patients. "Lucy, are you hurt or frightened? Has anyone threatened you tonight?" Lucy shook her head. "Sarah took good care of me. She saved my life and gave me warm clothes and food. But the men with guns are making Papa and Mama scared." Dr. Hayes stood and faced Crawford directly. "Captain, this child has been traumatized enough for one day. I suggest we resolve this matter with the least additional distress to her and her family." Sarah watched this exchange with growing hope. The arrival of community leaders had transformed the confrontation from an isolated incident that Crawford could control through intimidation into a public examination of his methods and motivations. Thomas Blackwater, who had remained silent during much of the discussion, now addressed Judge Fleming directly. "Your Honor, my family seeks only to live peacefully on the land where our people have always lived. We harm no one and ask nothing except to be left alone." Judge Fleming studied Thomas carefully, taking in his educated speech and dignified bearing. "Mr. Blackwater, you speak English remarkably well. Where did you receive your education?" "Mission school in North Carolina, then 2 years at the Cherokee Seminary in Oklahoma before—" Thomas paused, the pain of forced relocation still evident in his voice. "Before we decided to return home." The revelation that Thomas was not only educated, but had actually been to Oklahoma Territory and chosen to return added another layer of complexity to the situation. This was not a Cherokee who had simply evaded removal, but one who had experienced exile and made the conscious decision to risk everything to return to his homeland. Benjamin Wright, the merchant, spoke up with obvious interest. "You've been to Oklahoma Territory? What are conditions like there for the Cherokee?" Thomas's expression grew somber. "Many have died. Disease, starvation, despair. The land they gave us is not suitable for our traditional ways of life. Families are broken. Culture is being lost. We chose to return and face the risks rather than watch our daughter grow up without knowing her true heritage." Mary added quietly, "We almost lost Lucy on the journey west. She was sick for months from bad water and poor food. When we decided to come home, her health improved. This land gives her life." The personal testimony was devastating in its simplicity. These were not abstract political fugitives, but parents who had made an agonizing choice to protect their child's welfare, even at great personal risk. Dr. Hayes, whose medical experience had given him extensive knowledge of the Cherokee removals. "Human cost," nodded grimly. "I've treated Cherokee who attempted the western journey. The mortality rate has been catastrophic, particularly among children and elders." Crawford saw his support eroding and made one final attempt to rally his position. "That's all very sad, but the law is the law. These Cherokee were ordered west, and they need to go west. Personal hardships don't override federal authority." Judge Fleming held up his hand. "Captain Crawford, before we discuss federal authority, I think we need to clarify exactly what authority you're exercising tonight. Have you been deputized by federal marshals? Do you have arrest warrants? Are you acting under direct orders from territorial officials?" The series of questions exposed the weakness of Crawford's legal position. His militia existed in a gray area of frontier law enforcement, with authority that was largely assumed rather than officially granted. "We're acting under citizens' arrest provisions," Crawford said defensively. "Any citizen can arrest federal fugitives. Citizens' arrest requires witnessing the commission of a crime," Judge Fleming replied smoothly. "What crime have you witnessed tonight?" Crawford gestured toward the Cherokee family. "Illegal presence in territory they're forbidden to occupy." "And when did you witness them entering this territory illegally?" Judge Fleming pressed. "Can you testify that they crossed territorial boundaries tonight? Or are you simply assuming their presence constitutes ongoing criminal activity?" Sarah watched this legal exchange with fascination. Judge Fleming was systematically dismantling Crawford's justification for action, using the militiaman's own claims against him. Crawford was clearly struggling now, his simple worldview of Cherokee law-breaking colliding with the complex realities of frontier law and due process. "Judge Fleming, with all due respect, you're splitting legal hairs while Cherokee fugitives stand right in front of us. I'm ensuring that any action taken tonight has proper legal foundation." Judge Fleming corrected. Captain Crawford, unless you can demonstrate clear legal authority for your intended actions, I suggest you consider whether pursuing this matter further serves the interests of justice or merely satisfies personal prejudices. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Crawford's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he realized that his authority was being publicly questioned by the very community he claimed to serve. Reverend Morrison stepped into the tense silence that followed. "Perhaps we might approach this matter from a different perspective entirely," he suggested. "Rather than focusing on law enforcement, we might consider the Christian principles that should guide our response to neighbors in need." Lucy, who had been following the adult conversation with remarkable comprehension, spoke up again with the directness that had characterized her contributions all evening. "Sarah was being Christian when she saved me from drowning. Are you saying that was wrong?" The question, posed by an 8-year-old to a group of armed adults, struck at the heart of the moral contradictions inherent in Crawford's position. How could saving a child's life be transformed into a crime worthy of armed intervention? Reverend Morrison smiled gently at Lucy. "No, child. Saving your life was exactly right. Mrs. Mitchell acted as any good Christian should act when faced with someone in need." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude toward the Reverend for publicly supporting her actions. Throughout the long evening of accusations and threats, she had begun to doubt whether her instinctive compassion had been appropriate given the larger political context. Dr. Hayes seized on the Reverend's statement to make a broader point. "Gentlemen, we have before us a clear example of Christian charity in action. Mrs. Mitchell saved a child's life, provided medical care and comfort, and facilitated the safe reunion of a family. I submit that these are exactly the values our community should be promoting, not punishing." Several of Crawford's own militia members were now looking distinctly uncomfortable. The moral framework being constructed by the community leaders made their aggressive stance increasingly difficult to justify, even to themselves. One of the younger militiamen, the same Pete Harrison who had initially found tracks by the river, spoke up hesitantly. "Captain, maybe we should think about this some more. I mean, if all they did was come get their kid." Crawford silenced him with a harsh look, but the damage was done. Dissent within his own ranks, combined with community opposition, had fatally undermined his position. Thomas Blackwater, sensing the shifting mood, addressed the broader group directly. "We understand the concerns about Cherokee presence in this territory. We're willing to discuss reasonable arrangements that address those concerns while allowing us to live peacefully." Judge Fleming looked interested. "What sort of arrangements, Mr. Blackwater?" Thomas exchanged glances with Mary before responding. "We could agree to regular reporting to territorial authorities, restrictions on travel, even relocation to specific areas if necessary. We ask only that families be kept together and children be allowed to grow up knowing their heritage." The Tash proposal was remarkably moderate, offering significant concessions to address legitimate concerns about Cherokee presence while maintaining the basic family structure that was clearly their highest priority. Benjamin Wright, the merchant, saw practical possibilities in such arrangements. If Cherokee families were willing to integrate into the territorial economy, participate in trade, perhaps even pay taxes, that could benefit everyone involved. Crawford looked aghast at the direction the conversation was taking. His simple solution of forced removal was being replaced by complex negotiations about coexistence and integration. "This is ridiculous," Crawford protested. "We're talking about rewarding law-breaking. These Cherokee have no legal right to be here, period." Dr. Hayes faced Crawford directly. "Captain, legal rights are established by human beings and can be modified by human beings when circumstances warrant. What we're discussing is finding practical solutions that serve everyone's interests." Sarah found her voice amid the community discussion. "If I may say something," she began, her words carrying across the clearing. "I've lived alone here for 18 months, and in all that time I've never felt safer than I have today, knowing that there are families like the Blackwaters living peacefully in these mountains." Her statement created another moment of reflection. Here was a white settler woman living in isolation, publicly testifying that Cherokee presence made her feel more secure rather than less safe. "Sarah speaks the truth," Mary said quietly. "Cherokee protect all people in these mountains. We watch for dangers, help travelers who are lost, share information about weather and animals. We are part of this land's community, not separate from it." The concept of Cherokee as protective, neighbors rather than threatening enemies, was clearly new to many of the assembled men. Crawford's narrative of danger and hostility was being systematically replaced by testimony of cooperation and mutual aid. Judge Fleming appeared to be reaching some kind of decision. "Captain Crawford, based on what I've observed tonight, I see no evidence of crimes requiring immediate law enforcement action. I see a family retrieving their rescued child and a community coming together to address complex challenges through dialogue rather than violence." Crawford's face darkened with frustrated anger. "Judge Fleming, you're making a mistake. Today it's one family. Tomorrow it's dozens. Before you know it, we'll have Cherokee settlements throughout the territory, all claiming they're peaceful and just want to be left alone." "And would that necessarily be a bad thing?" Reverend Morrison asked mildly. "If Cherokee families are living peacefully, contributing to the community, raising their children to be productive citizens, where is the harm?" Crawford stared at the Reverend in disbelief. "Where is the harm? They're Indians. They're not supposed to be here." The naked prejudice in Crawford's outburst created an uncomfortable silence among the community representatives. His mask of legal authority had slipped, revealing the simple racial hostility that truly motivated his actions. Judge Fleming's voice carried quiet authority when he finally spoke. "Captain Crawford, I think this discussion has clarified the real issues we're dealing with tonight. I suggest you and your men return to your homes and allow this family to reunite in peace." Crawford looked around the circle of community leaders, recognizing that he had lost not just the immediate confrontation, but potentially his standing as a respected voice in territorial affairs. His aggressive approach had backfired, exposing him as motivated more by prejudice than by legitimate law enforcement concerns. "This isn't over," Crawford said, his voice carrying the promise of future conflict. "Mark my words, gentlemen, you'll regret this night's work when Cherokee problems multiply throughout the territory." With that threat, Crawford gestured for his men to mount up. Several of them looked relieved to be leaving, their enthusiasm for confrontation clearly dampened by the evening's developments. As they rode away into the darkness, their departure seemed to lift a weight of tension from Sarah's small clearing. Dr. Hayes approached Sarah directly. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've shown remarkable courage tonight. The community owes you a debt of gratitude for your compassion and steadfastness." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected recognition. "I only did what anyone should do when faced with a child in danger." "Perhaps," Dr. Hayes replied, "but not everyone would have had the strength to stand by their convictions under such pressure." Thomas and Mary approached together, Lucy skipping beside them with the resilience that only children possess after surviving adult crises. "Mrs. Mitchell," Thomas said formally, "our family will never forget what you've done for us. Not just saving Lucy's life, but standing with us when it would have been easier to turn away." Mary stepped forward and, to Sarah's surprise, embraced her warmly. "You are part of our family now," she said in her accented English. "Cherokee do not forget such kindness." Lucy tugged on Sarah's skirt, looking up with bright eyes. "Can I come visit you again? I want to learn more English words, and maybe you could teach me to read like the white children do." Sarah looked down at the remarkable child, who had transformed her solitary life in the span of a single day. "I would love that, Lucy. I would love that very much." As the community representatives prepared to depart, Judge Fleming approached Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "Mrs. Mitchell, I suspect we haven't heard the last of Captain Crawford's concerns about Cherokee presence in the territory. If you or the Blackwater family need legal assistance in the future, please don't hesitate to contact me." The offer of ongoing protection from the territory's highest legal authority represented a significant victory, though Sarah suspected Crawford's threats meant that challenges would indeed continue. As the riders departed and quiet returned to her homestead, Sarah found herself standing in her dooryard with the Cherokee family that had so dramatically entered her life. The stars overhead seemed brighter than they had in months, and for the first time since David's death, she felt part of something larger than her own solitary struggle for survival. "What happens now?" she asked Thomas. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Now we go home to our settlement and share the story of the white woman who saved our daughter and stood with us against those who would harm our family. Tonight, Mrs. Mitchell, you became legendary among the Cherokee people." The idea of becoming a Cherokee legend struck Sarah as both humbling and extraordinary. She had begun the day as a lonely widow washing clothes by the river. She was ending it as someone who had found family, purpose, and belonging in the most unexpected way possible. Lucy took her hand one more time. "Will you come visit us soon? I want to show you where we live, and Grandmother will want to meet you." Sarah squeezed the small hand gently. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." As the Cherokee family prepared to depart for their mountain settlement, Sarah realized that her life had been irrevocably changed by a single moment of compassion beside the Tennessee River. The lonely widow who had saved a drowning child had found not just friends, but a new family and a deeper purpose than she had ever imagined possible. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at Sarah's homestead, and the October morning air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching the mist rise from the Tennessee River while her coffee brewed over the rekindled fire. The solitude that had once defined her existence now felt temporary, purposeful, a calm between visits from her new Cherokee family, rather than the endless isolation it had been before. True to their word, the Blackwater family had returned several times. Lucy had spent 2 full days at Sarah's cabin, eagerly learning to read simple words and helping with household chores while chattering constantly in her mixture of Cherokee and English. Thomas had brought tools to repair Sarah's roof, refusing any payment except the pleasure of her company at meals. Mary had shared Cherokee methods for preserving vegetables that would keep Sarah's garden harvest fresh well into the spring. More significantly, other Cherokee from the mountain settlement had begun visiting, always carefully, always with respect for Sarah's privacy and safety, but with increasing frequency as word spread through their community about the white woman who had saved Lucy and stood against Crawford's militia. This morning was special. Today, Sarah would finally visit the Cherokee settlement that had become such an important part of her thoughts and dreams. Thomas had extended the invitation formally through Grandmother Singing Bird, the eldest member of their community, whose approval carried the weight of tradition and authority. Sarah had spent days preparing for the visit, uncertain about appropriate gifts or behavior. Mary had quietly provided guidance, explaining that Cherokee hospitality expected nothing but an open heart and respectful curiosity. Still, Sarah had prepared small presents, needles and thread for the women, fishhooks for the men, peppermint, candy for the children, and several of David's books for anyone interested in improving their English reading. As she finished her morning preparations, Sarah heard the familiar sound of Cherokee voices approaching through the forest. Lucy's laughter rang out clearly, followed by Thomas's deeper tones and Mary's musical Cherokee phrases. They emerged from the tree line like figures from another world, moving with the silent efficiency that still amazed Sarah, despite her growing familiarity with Cherokee woodcraft. Lucy ran ahead as always, launching herself into Sarah's arms with the unself-conscious affection that had developed between them. In 3 weeks, the child had become the daughter Sarah had never been able to have, while Sarah had filled the role of beloved aunt in Lucy's expanding world. "Sarah!" Lucy exclaimed in English, then switched to rapid Cherokee that Sarah was beginning to understand in bits and pieces. Something about excitement, something about grandmother, something about a special ceremony. Thomas smiled at Sarah's obvious confusion. Lucy is excited about today's visit, but she's also trying to explain something that should probably wait until we reach the settlement. Mary approached with her usual grace, carrying a beautifully woven basket that she presented to Sarah. "From the women of our community," she explained, "for carrying your belongings when you travel with us." Sarah accepted the gift with deep gratitude, recognizing the hours of skilled work represented in the basket's intricate patterns. "It's beautiful, Mary. Thank you all so much." As they prepared to depart, Thomas outlined the journey ahead. "It's about 2 hours through the mountains, following trails that few white people have ever seen. The path is safe, but requires attention to footing in several places." Sarah had dressed practically in her sturdiest boots and simplest clothing, with a warm shawl for the mountain altitude. The October day was clear but cool, perfect for the kind of hiking that lay ahead. They set off along a trail that began as an almost invisible gap in the forest, but gradually revealed itself as an ancient pathway worn smooth by generations of Cherokee feet. Thomas led the way, followed by Lucy, who seemed to float over obstacles that caused Sarah to step carefully. Mary brought up the rear, her presence a constant reassurance as they climbed steadily into the mountains. The trail wound through landscapes of breathtaking beauty. Ancient oaks and maples displayed their autumn colors in brilliant reds, yellows, and oranges that seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight. Clear streams crossed their path repeatedly, providing opportunities to rest and drink, while Thomas shared Cherokee names for plants, animals, and geographic features they encountered. Lucy served as an enthusiastic translator and guide, pointing out her favorite climbing trees, the best berry patches, and the places where different animals could be observed. Her knowledge of the forest was encyclopedic despite her young age, reflecting a childhood spent learning from Cherokee elders who viewed the natural world as an extension of their community. "Sarah," Lucy said as they paused beside a particularly beautiful waterfall, "do you know why Cherokee children learn so much about the forest?" Sarah shook her head, curious about Lucy's perspective on her own education. "Because the forest is our grandmother," Lucy explained seriously. "Just like you learn about your family, we learn about our grandmother forest. She takes care of us, so we take care of her." The simple explanation captured a worldview that Sarah found both foreign and deeply appealing. The Cherokee relationship with their environment was based on reciprocity and respect rather than dominance and exploitation. As they climbed higher, the trail became more challenging but also more spectacular. They crossed narrow ridges with views that stretched for miles across the Tennessee mountains, passed through groves of ancient hemlocks that created natural cathedrals of green twilight, and navigated rocky sections where Thomas's strong hand proved invaluable in helping Sarah maintain her footing. "How much farther?" Sarah asked during one rest stop, not from impatience, but from growing excitement about reaching their destination. "Just over the next ridge," Thomas replied. "You'll hear the settlement before you see it, children playing, women talking, the sounds of daily life." Sure enough, as they crested the final ridge, Sarah began to hear human voices carried on the mountain breeze. Children's laughter, the rhythmic sound of someone chopping wood, a woman singing in Cherokee while she worked. The sounds of a living community hidden away in one of the most remote corners of Tennessee. The settlement itself took Sarah's breath away. Nestled in a protected valley, surrounded by towering peaks, it consisted of perhaps 20 structures arranged in a loose circle around a central area where a large fire burned continuously. The buildings were a mixture of traditional Cherokee architecture and adaptations necessary for their hidden existence. Some were traditional log homes, others were more temporary structures that could be dismantled quickly if necessary. Gardens were scattered throughout the settlement, showing evidence of careful cultivation even this late in the season. Children's voices rang out from various directions, and Sarah could see adults engaged in the daily activities that sustained their community: cooking, crafting, teaching, maintaining their homes. As their small group descended into the settlement, Sarah became aware that their arrival was being noticed. Work paused, conversations quieted, and faces turned toward them with expressions of curiosity and welcome. Lucy ran ahead, calling out in Cherokee to announce their arrival, and within moments they were surrounded by smiling Cherokee faces. Thomas made formal introductions in both Cherokee and English, presenting Sarah to the community as the woman who saved our Lucy and stood with us against those who would harm our people. The introductions were met with warm nods, gentle touches on Sarah's arm, and words of welcome in Cherokee that needed no translation. An elderly Cherokee woman approached, with obvious authority, moving slowly but with great dignity. Her white hair was braided with ribbons and feathers, and her weathered face showed the wisdom of many decades. This could only be Grandmother Singing Bird, the community elder who had approved Sarah's visit. Grandmother Singing Bird studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then spoke in Cherokee to Thomas, who translated with obvious pleasure. Grandmother says you have kind eyes and a brave heart. She says the spirits brought you to Lucy for reasons that reach beyond saving one child. Sarah didn't know how to respond to such a profound statement, so she simply nodded respectfully and said, "I'm honored to be here, Grandmother." The old woman smiled and replied in heavily accented but clear English, "You call me grandmother, I call you daughter. This is the Cherokee way." The simple declaration of kinship moved Sarah deeply. In a few short weeks, she had gone from complete isolation to being claimed as daughter by a Cherokee grandmother, as sister by Cherokee parents, and as aunt by a Cherokee child. The formal introductions completed, Sarah was given a tour of the settlement that revealed the remarkable achievement these Cherokee had accomplished. Despite their precarious situation as fugitives from federal removal policies, they had created a functioning community that preserved traditional ways while adapting to new necessities. She saw workshops where Cherokee craftsmen created pottery, baskets, and tools, using methods passed down through generations. Gardens where traditional Cherokee crops grew alongside vegetables adopted from white agriculture. A small school where Cherokee children learned to read and write in both Cherokee syllabary and English alphabet, preparing them for a future that would require navigating both worlds. Most impressive was the community's organization. Despite having no formal government or official leadership structure, the settlement operated smoothly through consensus and traditional Cherokee methods of decision-making. Disputes were resolved through discussion, resources were shared according to need, and everyone contributed according to their abilities. "How do you make it work so well?" Sarah asked Thomas as they paused beside the central fire where several families were preparing a communal meal. Thomas considered the question carefully. "Cherokee have always lived this way, as one people sharing the gifts of the earth. What you call remarkable, we call traditional." Mary joined the conversation, her arms full of corn from the settlement's harvest. "Also, when people live in danger together, they must trust each other completely. No room for selfishness when everyone's survival depends on working together. As the day progressed, Sarah was invited to participate in various aspects of settlement life. She helped prepare food for the evening meal, learning Cherokee cooking methods that transformed simple ingredients into delicious dishes. She watched Cherokee women weave baskets with techniques that produced items of both beauty and utility. She listened to Cherokee men discuss hunting strategies that balanced their need for meat with their responsibility to preserve animal populations. Most moving of all, she was invited to observe Cherokee children's lessons, where ancient stories were told to pass down cultural wisdom and historical knowledge. Lucy proudly demonstrated her improving English reading skills, then helped translate Cherokee stories for Sarah's benefit. One story particularly captured Sarah's attention. It told of a time when Cherokee and white people lived as neighbors and friends, sharing knowledge and helping each other survive in the wilderness. The story emphasized that skin color was less important than heart color. Whether someone's heart was generous or selfish, brave or cowardly, kind or cruel. "Is this how you see me?" Sarah asked Grandmother Singing Bird during a quiet moment. "As someone with the right heart color." Grandmother Singing Bird smiled. "I see you as someone who heard a child crying and did not ask her color before helping. That tells me everything about your heart color." As evening approached, Sarah realized that something special was being prepared. Cherokee families were gathering around the central fire with an air of ceremony that suggested this was more than a simple meal. Thomas and Mary appeared in traditional Cherokee clothing that was more elaborate than their usual daily wear, and Lucy wore a beautiful dress decorated with beadwork and ribbons. "Sarah," Thomas said formally, "our community wishes to honor you with a ceremony that recognizes your place among us. If you are willing to participate, we would like to make official what our hearts already know, that you are a Cherokee family." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she understood what was being offered. Not just friendship or alliance, but full adoption into Cherokee culture, a recognition that would make her officially part of their community with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. "I would be deeply honored," Sarah managed to say through her emotion. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Cherokee drummers created rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the mountains themselves. Dancers moved around the fire with grace and power that told stories without words. Singers filled the air with melodies that carried the weight of centuries. Grandmother Singing Bird spoke at length in Cherokee, her words translated by Thomas for Sarah's benefit. She told the story of Sarah's rescue of Lucy, her stand against Crawford's militia, and her growing friendship with Cherokee families. She spoke of ancient Cherokee prophecies about friendship between peoples, and of the sacred obligations created when one person saves another's life. Then came the moment Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Grandmother Singing Bird approached, carrying a magnificent necklace made of polished stones, carved bone, and silver work that represented the finest Cherokee craftsmanship. As she placed it around Sarah's neck, the old woman spoke in English for the entire community to understand. "By the power of the Moon Law, the ancient Cherokee tradition that allows adoption of those who prove their worth through great deeds, I name you Sarah Singing Waters, daughter of the Cherokee people, sister to all who dwell in these mountains, mother aunt to our children, keeper of our stories." The Cherokee name given to her, Singing Waters, referred to the river where she had saved Lucy, but Thomas explained that it also honored her voice in speaking for Cherokee rights during the confrontation with Crawford's militia. As the necklace settled around her shoulders, Sarah felt a transformation that went beyond ceremony or symbolism. She was no longer the lonely widow who had struggled to survive alone beside the Tennessee River. She was Sarah Singing Waters, Cherokee by adoption, with a community that would support her and children who would call her aunt and elders who would share their wisdom with her. The celebration continued late into the night, with Cherokee families sharing food, stories, and music with their newest member. Children who had been shy earlier now approached Sarah freely, chattering in Cherokee and English about their daily lives, their games, their dreams for the future. Lucy remained constantly by Sarah's side, beaming with pride at having been instrumental in bringing such an honored guest into their community. "Now you're really my Cherokee aunt," she whispered to Sarah during a quiet moment. "Grandmother said the moon law makes it official forever." As the evening wound down and families began retiring to their homes, Thomas approached Sarah with one final surprise. "Sarah Singing Waters," he said with formal courtesy, "the Cherokee Council has made a decision about your place in our community. If you wish, we would like to build you a home here in our settlement, where you can live as a full member of our people." The offer took Sarah's breath away. A chance to leave behind her isolated existence and become part of a real community, surrounded by people who valued her contributions and cared about her welfare. "What about my homestead by the river?" she asked practically. Mary smiled. "Keep it if you wish. Cherokee homes are where the heart finds peace. Some hearts need one place, some need more than one." Sarah looked around the settlement, seeing Cherokee families settling in for the night, children already asleep in their parents' arms, adults making plans for tomorrow's work. She thought of her lonely cabin by the river, of the isolation that had defined her existence since David's death, of the future she had imagined spending alone. Then she looked at Lucy, sleeping peacefully against her mother's shoulder, and at Grandmother Singing Bird, nodding approval of the proceedings, and at Thomas and Mary, who had become the siblings she'd never had. "I would be honored to have a home here," Sarah said firmly. "But I also want to keep my cabin by the river. As Mary said, some hearts need more than one place, and I think mine might be one of them." The arrangement was perfect. She would have a base in the Cherokee settlement where she could participate fully in community life, and she would maintain her riverside cabin as a place of solitude and as a bridge between Cherokee and white worlds. When white travelers or officials needed to communicate with the Cherokee, they could do so safely through Sarah's mediation. As the ceremony concluded and the community began to disperse, Grandmother Singing Bird approached Sarah one final time. The old woman pressed a small carved wooden figure into Sarah's palm, a turtle, symbol of longevity and wisdom in Cherokee tradition. "For your new life, daughter," Grandmother Singing Bird said in her careful English. "Turtle carries her home with her always, but she knows where she belongs." Sarah closed her fingers around the turtle carving, understanding its significance. Like the turtle, she would carry her sense of home within herself while knowing she belonged to this Cherokee community that had claimed her as family. Over the following months, Sarah's dual existence flourished. She spent several days each week at the Cherokee settlement, participating in community life, helping to teach English to Cherokee children, and serving as a bridge between Cherokee and white worlds when necessary. She also maintained her riverside cabin, which became an informal meeting place where Cherokee and sympathetic white settlers could interact safely. Crawford's threatened troubles never materialized in the dramatic fashion he had promised. Judge Fleming's support and the community's acceptance of Cherokee presence had shifted public opinion away from aggressive removal efforts toward grudging tolerance. Crawford himself seemed to have lost influence after his failed confrontation at Sarah's homestead. Dr. Hayes became a regular visitor to both Sarah's cabin and the Cherokee settlement, providing medical care to Cherokee families who had been without professional medical attention for years. His partnership with Cherokee healers created a blend of traditional and modern medical practices that benefited everyone involved. Most importantly, Sarah found herself part of a growing network of relationships that enriched her life beyond anything she had imagined possible. Lucy continued to be a regular presence, spending days at Sarah's cabin and chattering constantly about her life, her lessons, her dreams for the future. Thomas and Mary became the siblings Sarah had never had, offering advice, support, and the kind of companionship that made daily work a pleasure rather than a burden. The Cherokee settlement thrived under the protection that Sarah's position in white society provided. Her ability to communicate with territorial authorities, to vouch for Cherokee peaceful intentions, and to serve as an early warning system for potential troubles allowed the community to live with greater security than they had enjoyed since their return from Oklahoma. As winter settled over the Tennessee mountains and Sarah prepared for her first Christmas as a Cherokee daughter, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had begun with a child's cry for help beside a swift-flowing river. The lonely widow who had lived in isolation had become Sarah Singing Waters, Cherokee by adoption, beloved by children, respected by elders, and essential to a community's survival. Standing on the porch of her riverside cabin, watching the Tennessee flow past on its eternal journey toward the sea, Sarah fingered the turtle carving that never left her pocket and smiled at the memory of Grandmother Singing Bird's words. She had indeed learned to carry her home within herself, while knowing exactly where she belonged. In the distance, she could hear Cherokee voices calling across the water, children playing, adults working, a community living freely in the land of their ancestors. Tomorrow, she would join them again, taking her place in the daily rhythm of Cherokee life that had become as natural to her as breathing. But tonight, she would sleep in the cabin where it all began, dreaming of a drowning child whose rescue had led to the greatest transformation of her life. Sarah Singing Waters, white woman and Cherokee daughter, keeper of bridges between worlds, had found her true home at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.